Millionaire proposes to his housekeeper. Her response leaves him speechless. The mansion was quiet in the early morning hours, the kind of stillness that only existed before the day began. Grace moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, her hands deftly arranging the breakfast tray. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as sunlight began to filter through the tall windows, casting a golden glow on the marble countertops. She carried the tray toward the dining room, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. For years, this had been her routine, rising before the rest of the house to ensure everything was perfect. The mansion belonged to Ethan Calloway, a self-made millionaire whose life was filled with opulence and influence. Grace had worked here for 3 years, and though she was grateful for the stability the job provided, she had always maintained a professional distance from the man at the center of it all. As she placed the tray on the long dining table, the door opened and Ethan entered. He was dressed casually in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd just woken up. He offered her a small smile, one that was polite but weary. "Good morning, Grace," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she replied, stepping back to allow him space. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've been up for a while," he observed. Grace nodded. "The usual preparations." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You're always so composed. Doesn't anything ever faze you?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered simply. "I've learned that staying composed helps in any situation." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned his attention to the window. Outside, the sprawling estate garden stretched out, perfectly manicured and serene. But Ethan's mind was far from serene. Later that day, Grace was in the library dusting the shelves when she overheard voices drifting in from the adjacent sitting room. Ethan was there with a group of his friends, their laughter and conversation punctuating the otherwise quiet house. "She's been with you how long now?" one of them asked, his tone laced with amusement. 3 years, Ethan replied, his voice measured. "Isn't it strange relying on someone so much?" another chimed in. "I mean, she practically runs your life, doesn't she?" Ethan's tone shifted, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. "Grace doesn't just work here. She's reliable, thoughtful, and—" "Oh, come on," the first voice interrupted, laughing. "Don't tell me you're catching feelings for the help." Grace froze, her heart pounding as silence fell in the room. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel the tension in the air. Ethan's response, when it came, was quiet but firm. "You don't know what you're talking about." His friends laughed it off, changing the subject, but Grace's chest tightened. She finished her work quickly, retreating to the staff quarters where she could collect her thoughts in peace. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Grace couldn't shake the memory of that conversation. She noticed Ethan watching her more often, his gaze thoughtful but unreadable. She tried to maintain her usual professionalism, but something about his presence felt heavier, more charged. One evening, as she was tidying the dining room after a late dinner, Ethan walked in. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly slumped, but his eyes were alert as they found hers. "Grace," he began, his tone unusually soft. "Do you have a moment?" She straightened, nodding. "Of course, Mr. Calloway." He gestured toward one of the chairs. "Please sit." Grace hesitated. In all her years working here, Ethan had never asked her to sit with him. She complied, her hands folding neatly in her lap as she waited for him to speak. "I've been meaning to say this for a while," he began, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his watch. "You've been an incredible part of this household. More than just a housekeeper, you've brought a sense of calm and order that I didn't even realize I needed." Grace blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. That means a lot." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "It's not just about your work, Grace. It's who you are. The way you carry yourself, the kindness you show to everyone here, it's remarkable." Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I'm just doing my job, sir." He smiled faintly. "That's what makes it so extraordinary. You make it look effortless." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with unspoken words. Grace finally broke the silence, her voice steady. "Is there something specific you needed to discuss?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I just wanted to thank you. For everything." Grace nodded, standing. "You're welcome, Mr. Calloway. If there's nothing else, I'll finish cleaning up." He watched her leave, his thoughts swirling. Grace, meanwhile, returned to her tasks, determined to keep her focus. But something had shifted between them, and she couldn't deny the weight of it. The days that followed were filled with subtle, unspoken tension. Ethan seemed to find excuses to linger in the same rooms as Grace, his conversations growing more personal. He asked about her life outside of work, her family, and her dreams, questions he had never posed before. Grace answered cautiously, her professionalism intact, but she couldn't ignore the warmth in his tone or the way his attention lingered on her. One afternoon, as Grace was arranging fresh flowers in the sitting room, Ethan entered, his expression unusually hesitant. He held a small book in his hand, its worn leather cover suggesting it was something important. "Grace," he said softly, drawing her attention. She turned, her hand stilling on the vase. "Yes, Mr. Calloway?" He gestured toward the book. "I was going through some old things and I found this. It belonged to my mother. She used to write down quotes and advice she thought were meaningful." Grace tilted her head, curious. "That sounds lovely." Ethan smiled faintly, stepping closer. "It made me think about the kind of wisdom you've shared with me over the years. You've helped me see things differently and I wanted to thank you for that." Grace blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "I'm not sure what I've done to deserve that kind of praise, but thank you." "You've done more than you realize," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. "And it's made me think about what I want out of life." Before Grace could respond, the door to the sitting room opened and Ethan's sister, Eleanor, strode in. She was elegant and commanding, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on Grace. "Ethan," Eleanor said, her tone clipped. "We need to talk." Ethan sighed, glancing at Grace apologetically. "Can it wait?" "No, it can't," Eleanor replied, her gaze flicking between them. "I'll be in the study." As she left, the tension in the room grew palpable. Grace quickly turned back to her task, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry about that," Ethan said quietly. "It's fine," Grace replied, keeping her voice even. "I should finish this anyway." Ethan hesitated before nodding. "We'll talk later." That evening, Grace retreated to her small room in the staff quarters, her mind racing. She couldn't deny the way Ethan's words made her feel, valued, seen, and if she was honest with herself, a little vulnerable. But she also knew the line between them was one that shouldn't be crossed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression uncertain but determined. "May I come in?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The room was modest, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the rest of the mansion, but Ethan didn't seem to notice. He turned to face her, his hands in his pockets. "I know this is unconventional," he began, his voice low. "But I need to say this." Grace's heart pounded, her hands clasping tightly in front of her. "What is it?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who see me as a means to an end. Money, power, influence. But you see me as a person. You've shown me what it means to be grounded, to care about something more than material wealth." "Mr. Calloway," Grace began, but he shook his head. "Please let me finish," he said gently. "You've changed the way I see the world, Grace. And I've realized that I don't just admire you, I care about you. Deeply." Grace's breath caught, her mind reeling. "Ethan, this isn't appropriate." "Maybe not," he admitted, his tone earnest. "But it's the truth. I don't care about the rules or the expectations anymore. I care about you." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "You don't understand what you're saying. Your life, your world, it's nothing like mine." "Then we'll make our own world," Ethan said firmly. "One where none of that matters." Grace shook her head, her voice breaking. "It's not that simple. People like me don't belong in places like this. You belong wherever you want to be," Ethan said, stepping closer. "And I want you to be with me." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Grace finally looked away, her voice trembling. "I need time to think." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I just needed you to know how I feel." As he left, Grace sank onto the edge of her bed, her emotions a whirlwind of fear, hope, and uncertainty. She had always prided herself on her independence, but for the first time she wondered if she was strong enough to follow her heart. Grace and Ethan settled into a new rhythm, one that balanced the demands of his corporate responsibilities with the simple pleasures of their shared life. The public scrutiny began to fade as the media shifted its focus to other stories, and the whispers among the elite circles grew quieter. One sunny afternoon, Grace decided to take a step toward her own dreams. She approached Ethan in his study, where he was reviewing documents but seemed more relaxed than usual. "Ethan," she began softly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about pursuing something I'm passionate about." He looked up, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I'm all ears." She took a seat across from him. "I want to open a bakery, a small place where I can bake and maybe even teach others." His eyes lit up. "That's wonderful. Have you started planning?" She nodded, excitement building. "I've been looking at some locations and drafting ideas for the menu. I want it to be a place that feels welcoming, where people can enjoy good food and good company." Ethan reached across the desk to take her hand. "I'm so proud of you. Whatever you need, I'm here to help." Grace squeezed his hand. "Thank you, but I want to do this on my own, or at least as much as possible. I appreciate your support, but it's important to me that I build this myself." He nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. Just know that I'm here if you need anything." Over the next few months, Grace threw herself into bringing her vision to life. She found a charming storefront in a quaint neighborhood, its large windows allowing sunlight to flood the space. With the help of Maria and a few other friends, she renovated the interior, choosing warm colors and cozy furnishings that made the bakery feel like an extension of her home. She named it Graceful Bites, a subtle nod to her own journey. The bakery quickly became a local favorite, known not just for its delicious pastries but for the welcoming atmosphere that Grace cultivated. She hired staff who shared her passion and even started offering baking classes for children on weekends. Ethan visited often, sometimes surprising her with lunch or just stopping by to see her in action. Watching her interact with customers, her face alight with joy, filled him with a happiness he hadn't known was possible. One evening, as they closed up the bakery together, Grace leaned against the counter, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I can't believe how well it's going," she said, a hint of disbelief in her voice. Ethan smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I never doubted you for a second." She looked up at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That's what partners do." As Grace's bakery flourished, Ethan found himself inspired to make changes within his own company. He initiated programs focused on community outreach and corporate social responsibility, much to the surprise of some of his executives. During a board meeting, he presented his vision. "It's not enough for us to be successful financially," he stated. "We have a responsibility to give back, to make a positive impact on the communities we serve." One of the board members, a seasoned executive named Thomas, raised an eyebrow. "This is a significant shift from our current strategy. Are you certain this is the right direction?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "I am. It's time we align our success with meaningful contributions to society." There was a murmur among the board members. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. "Very well. Let's see where this leads." Ethan's initiatives were well received publicly, enhancing the company's reputation and silencing some of his earlier critics. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, much like Grace did with her bakery. One weekend, they decided to host a charity event together, a community fair that combined the best of their worlds. Grace provided the baked goods, and Ethan's company sponsored activities and prizes for local families. The event was a resounding success. Children laughed and played, families connected, and there was a palpable sense of joy in the air. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Grace and Ethan stood together watching the festivities wind down. "This is what it's all about," Grace said softly, her hand intertwined with his. "Making a difference, even if it's just bringing people together for a day." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the happy faces around them. "You've changed me, Grace. You've shown me what truly matters." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We've changed each other." Despite their happiness, life continued to present challenges. One afternoon, Grace received an unexpected visitor at the bakery, a woman who introduced herself as Linda, an old acquaintance from her past. "Grace, it's been so long," Linda said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. "Linda, what brings you here?" "I heard about your engagement," Linda replied, glancing around the bakery. "And this lovely place you've set up. You've certainly come a long way." Grace sensed an undercurrent of something unsettling. "I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had." Linda leaned in slightly. "I remember when things weren't so prosperous for you. It would be a shame if certain details about your past were to surface now." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "What are you getting at?" "I'm just saying that sometimes the past has a way of catching up," Linda said smoothly. "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement to keep things discreet." Grace's eyes narrowed. "Are you trying to blackmail me?" Linda feigned offense. "Oh, nothing of the sort. Just a friendly suggestion." Feeling a surge of anger, Grace stood her ground. I have nothing to hide and I won't be intimidated. Please leave. Linda's expression hardened. Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. As Linda exited the bakery, Grace felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She hadn't thought about that part of her life in years. Could this threaten everything she'd built with Ethan? That evening, Grace confided in Ethan. I need to tell you something, she began hesitantly. He took her hands in his. You can tell me anything. She took a deep breath. Before I started working at your estate, I was involved in a difficult situation. My late husband had accumulated debts I didn't know about, and after he passed, collectors came after me. I was desperate and made some poor decisions to keep a roof over our heads. Ethan listened intently, his expression compassionate. I feared that if anyone found out, especially your family or the media, it would reflect poorly on you, she continued. Today, someone from that time showed up, implying she would expose my past unless I paid her. Ethan's grip on her hands tightened. I'm so sorry you went through that. But you have nothing to be ashamed of. She looked into his eyes, tears welling up. I just don't want anything to hurt you or us. He pulled her into a comforting embrace. Grace, your past doesn't change how I feel about you. We all have things we wish had been different. What matters is who you are now. She relaxed slightly in his arms. Thank you for understanding. He kissed her forehead. We'll handle this together. If she tries anything, we'll address it head on. True to his word, Ethan enlisted the help of a trusted legal advisor to ensure that any attempts at defamation or blackmail would be dealt with swiftly. He also made a public statement highlighting the importance of overcoming adversity and being transparent about one's journey. When Linda realized that her plan had failed, she disappeared from their lives as quickly as she had appeared. With that hurdle behind them, Grace and Ethan focused on planning their wedding. They decided on a modest ceremony at the estate, inviting close friends, family, and members of the community who had become dear to them. On the day of the wedding, the sun shone brightly, and the gardens were in full bloom. Grace walked down the aisle accompanied by her son, Jacob, who had taken leave from college to be there. As she reached Ethan, the world seemed to fade away. He gazed at her with a depth of love and admiration that took her breath away. The officiant began the ceremony, and when it was time for their vows, Ethan spoke first. Grace, from the moment you walked into my life, you brought light into my world. You've taught me about kindness, resilience, and the true meaning of love. I promise to stand by you through every joy and challenge, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, and to cherish every moment we share. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks as she began her vows. Ethan, you saw me when I felt invisible. You believed in me when I doubted myself. With you, I found a partner, a confidant, and a love deeper than I ever imagined possible. I promise to walk beside you, to lift you up, and to nurture the life we build together. As they exchanged rings, a sense of profound peace settled over them. They were exactly where they were meant to be. The reception was a joyous affair filled with laughter, music, and heartfelt toasts. Even Eleanor approached them with a tentative smile. I must admit, she said to Grace, I was skeptical at first. But I can see how happy you make him. Welcome to the family. Grace accepted the olive branch graciously. Thank you, Eleanor. That means a lot. Margaret also offered her congratulations, pulling Ethan aside at one point. You've chosen well, she said simply. Your mother would be proud. Ethan felt a swell of emotion. That means more than you know. As the evening wound down, Grace and Ethan stole away from the crowd, finding a quiet spot under a canopy of stars. Do you remember when we first talked in the garden? Ethan asked, his eyes reflecting the night sky. She laughed softly. I was pruning roses and you startled me. He chuckled. I think that was the moment I realized there was something special about you. She leaned into him. We've come a long way since then. Indeed we have, he agreed, wrapping an arm around her. And I can't wait to see what the future holds. They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of distant laughter and music drifting on the breeze. Grace sighed contentedly. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Ethan kissed her gently. That's because we're home with each other. Their journey was far from over, but together they knew they could face whatever came next. With love as their foundation and a shared commitment to making a difference, Grace and Ethan looked forward to a future filled with hope, purpose, and endless possibilities. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Grace and Ethan settled into married life, a mix of quiet mornings, bustling days, and evenings spent planning for the future. The bakery continued to thrive, drawing in regulars and new faces alike, while Ethan's work in reshaping his company's mission gained momentum. They found a balance between their individual passions and their shared goals, always carving out time for one another despite their busy schedules. One evening, as they sat together in the cozy living room of the estate, Grace brought up an idea that had been on her mind. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant but thoughtful, "about the staff here at the estate. Many of them have been with you for years, but I wonder if they've ever thought about what comes next for them." Ethan looked up from the book he'd been reading, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Grace continued, "some of them might want to pursue other opportunities or learn new skills, but they might feel stuck, like I did before I opened the bakery. What if we created a program to help them? Training, education, anything that could give them the tools to follow their dreams?" Ethan set the book aside, his expression softening. "That's an incredible idea, Grace. They've given so much to this household, it's only right that we support them in return." Encouraged by his response, Grace began drafting a plan. She envisioned workshops, mentorship sessions, and even partnerships with local businesses to provide opportunities for career growth. Maria, always supportive, agreed to help organize the logistics, and within weeks, they had the framework for what they called the Future Forward Initiative. The staff's reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Many expressed gratitude for the chance to explore new possibilities, while others saw it as a way to enrich their current roles. Grace felt a deep sense of fulfillment seeing their enthusiasm and knowing she was helping them take steps toward brighter futures. While Grace worked on the initiative, Ethan faced a new challenge at his company. A rival business, known for its cutthroat tactics, began encroaching on his market. The board urged him to adopt a more aggressive strategy, but Ethan remained steadfast in his belief that integrity should come first. During a tense meeting, Thomas, the same board member who had initially questioned Ethan's community-focused approach, voiced his concerns. "If we don't push back, they'll eat into our profits," Thomas argued. "We can't afford to take the high road this time." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I understand your concerns, but sacrificing our values for short-term gains isn't the answer. Our reputation is built on trust and ethical practices. If we compromise that, we lose more than just market share." The room fell silent as the board absorbed his words. Finally, Thomas nodded reluctantly. "All right, Ethan. We'll follow your lead." Ethan's resolve paid off. By doubling down on transparency and building stronger relationships with their clients, his company not only retained its market position but also earned widespread praise for its integrity. Back at the estate, Grace was preparing for a special event, the inaugural gathering for the Future Forward Initiative. She had invited several speakers from various industries to share their experiences with the staff, and the excitement in the air was palpable. As the event unfolded, Grace watched with pride as the staff engaged with the speakers, asking questions and sharing their own aspirations. Maria, who had taken on a leadership role in the initiative, gave an inspiring speech about the importance of seizing opportunities and supporting one another. Ethan arrived midway through the event, his eyes lighting up as he spotted Grace at the front of the room. After her closing remarks, he pulled her aside. "This is amazing," he said, his admiration clear. "You've created something truly special here." Grace smiled, her cheeks flushing. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "This was all you, Grace. Your vision, your heart, it's what makes everything you touch better." As the months turned into a year, Grace and Ethan's lives continued to intertwine in meaningful ways. They supported each other's dreams, celebrated each other's victories, and faced challenges as a team. Their love grew deeper with each passing day, rooted in the trust and respect they had for one another. But life had a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One afternoon, as Grace was closing up the bakery, she received an urgent call from Ethan. "Grace," he said, his voice tense. "There's been a problem at the company." Her heart sank. "What happened?" "It's a legal issue," he explained. "One of our suppliers has been accused of unethical practices, and it's threatening to pull us into the fallout." "I'll be there as soon as I can," Grace said, grabbing her bag. When she arrived at Ethan's office, she found him in a heated discussion with his legal team. His jaw was tight, and his usual calm demeanor was strained. Grace waited until the meeting ended before approaching him. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The supplier we've been working with for years has been accused of exploiting workers overseas. We had no idea, but now it's all over the news and people are questioning our involvement." Grace placed a hand on his arm. "We'll figure this out. You've always been transparent about your values. That counts for something." He nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Thank you, Grace. I don't know what I'd do without you." Together, they strategized a response, focusing on transparency and accountability. Ethan held a press conference to address the issue, openly condemning the supplier's actions and outlining steps to ensure ethical practices in the future. His honesty resonated with the public, and while the situation was far from resolved, it marked a turning point in how his company was perceived. The experience strengthened Ethan and Grace's resolve to stay true to their principles, no matter the cost. It also reminded them of the importance of leaning on one another during difficult times. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Ethan reached for Grace's hand. "You've been my anchor through all of this," he said softly. "I don't say it enough, but I'm so grateful for you." Grace smiled, her heart full. "We're in this together, Ethan. Always." As the legal issues surrounding Ethan's company slowly resolved, a sense of calm returned to their lives. Grace and Ethan leaned into their shared values, using the experience as a catalyst to strengthen their commitments to both their community and each other. One Saturday morning, Grace stood in the bakery kitchen, experimenting with a new recipe for lemon lavender scones. The smell wafted through the air, drawing in Ethan, who had arrived early to surprise her. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she moved with precision and focus, her apron dusted with flour. "Smells like perfection," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. Grace glanced up, startled but smiling. "You're up early?" He stepped closer, grabbing a piece of dough from the counter to taste it. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd see what you were up to." She swatted his hand playfully. "That's not ready yet." He chuckled, reaching for a clean apron hanging on the wall. "Teach me. I want to help." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You want to bake?" "Why not?" he said, tying the apron around his waist. "I already know you're the expert, but I wouldn't mind learning a thing or two." Despite her initial skepticism, Grace handed him a bowl and instructed him on how to mix the batter. Ethan's attempts were clumsy but endearing, and soon the kitchen was filled with laughter as he accidentally spilled flour on himself. "You're a natural," Grace teased, giggling. "Clearly," Ethan replied with mock seriousness, brushing flour off his nose. The light-hearted moment felt like a snapshot of the life they were building, simple, joyful, and filled with partnership. Outside of their shared moments at the bakery and home, Grace continued her work with the Future Forward initiative. Its success exceeded her expectations, and the program began attracting attention from other organizations interested in replicating the model. Grace was invited to speak at several conferences, sharing her journey and the impact of the initiative. At one such event, she found herself on stage in front of a packed audience, her nerves threatening to get the better of her. But as she glanced into the crowd, she spotted Ethan sitting in the front row, his expression filled with pride and encouragement. That steadying presence gave her the confidence she needed. "Opportunities can transform lives," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But it takes more than resources, it takes belief. Belief in others and belief in ourselves. That's what this initiative is about. It's about showing people that they are capable of so much more than they realize." The audience erupted in applause, and when the event concluded, Ethan was the first to greet her backstage. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Grace smiled, her heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you." As Grace's influence grew, so did her responsibilities. Balancing her work with the initiative, the bakery, and her role as Ethan's partner became increasingly challenging. Ethan noticed the strain and suggested they take a weekend getaway to recharge. They drove to a quiet lakeside cabin, leaving behind the demands of their busy lives. The serene setting allowed them to reconnect, spending their days hiking, cooking together, and simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, as they sat by the fire pit under a canopy of stars, Ethan reached for Grace's hand. "You've been carrying so much lately," he said gently. "I want to make sure you're not losing yourself in everything we're building." Grace looked at him, her expression soft. "I won't lie, it's a lot. But it's also fulfilling. I've never felt so alive." He squeezed her hand. "I just want to make sure you're taking time for yourself too. You deserve to rest and enjoy what we've created." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I'm enjoying it, Ethan. Especially moments like this." For a while, they sat in silence, the crackling fire and the gentle lapping of the lake providing a soothing backdrop. It was a reminder of why they had worked so hard, to create a life where moments like these could exist. Back in the city, Ethan's company began experiencing a resurgence in its reputation and success, thanks in large part to the ethical initiatives he had championed. His work inspired others in the industry to rethink their practices, and he found himself invited to panels and think tanks to discuss the importance of corporate responsibility. At one such event, a fellow CEO approached him after his speech. "You've set a new standard, Ethan," the man said. "It's impressive, but it can't have been easy." Ethan smiled, glancing toward Grace, who was mingling with the crowd nearby. "Nothing worthwhile ever is. But having someone who believes in you makes all the difference." Meanwhile, Grace's son Jacob began making waves of his own. Inspired by his mother's perseverance and Ethan's mentorship, he started a small business that combined technology with sustainability. Watching him thrive brought Grace immense pride and underscored the ripple effect of their journey. One evening, Jacob joined Grace and Ethan for dinner at the estate. As they talked about his latest project, he turned to Ethan. "I just wanted to say thank you," Jacob said earnestly, "for supporting my mom and for being an example of what it means to lead with integrity." Ethan was momentarily speechless, moved by the young man's words. "The honor is mine, Jacob. You're building something amazing, and I'm proud to see the person you're becoming." Grace watched the exchange with tears in her eyes, her heart full as she realized how much their lives had changed, and how far they had come. As the years passed, Grace and Ethan's journey became a testament to love, resilience, and the power of believing in each other. Their lives, once rooted in vastly different worlds, had intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. A new chapter together. The bakery flourished, with Grace expanding to 2 additional locations. Each bakery carried her personal touch, warm, inviting spaces that reflected her story and values. Ethan's company thrived as well, recognized as a leader in ethical practices and community-driven initiatives. Together they had built a life filled with purpose, joy, and a shared commitment to making the world a little brighter. Their greatest joy, however, came from the relationships they nurtured, both with each other and with those around them. Grace's son Jacob had grown into a compassionate, ambitious young man, running his own successful business. He often credited his mother and Ethan for showing him the value of integrity and hard work. A celebration of love and legacy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grace and Ethan decided to host a celebration at the estate. It wasn't just an anniversary party, it was a way to thank the people who had supported them along the way. The gardens were transformed into a magical setting, with twinkling lights strung through the trees and tables filled with food and laughter. Maria, now managing one of the bakery locations, gave a heartfelt toast. "Grace, you've always been a light for everyone around you. Watching you grow, not just as a businesswoman but as a person, has been one of the greatest honors of my life. And Ethan, you've shown us what it means to lead with kindness and heart. Together, you've built something truly beautiful." Ethan stood, his gaze filled with admiration as he looked at Grace. "Everything good in my life started the day Grace walked into it. She's my partner, my inspiration, and my greatest love." Grace wiped away a tear as she rose to join him. "And Ethan, you've shown me what it means to dream again, to trust, and to believe in the possibility of a better future. I'm grateful every day for you and the life we've created." The guests raised their glasses, cheers echoing into the evening sky as Grace and Ethan shared a tender kiss, reflecting on their journey. Later that night, after the guests had left, Grace and Ethan sat together on the porch, the estate quiet and still. The anniversary celebration had been a reminder of how far they had come, not just as individuals but as a couple who had weathered challenges and celebrated victories together. Grace rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his. "Do you ever think about where we started?" she asked softly. "All the time," Ethan replied. "I think about that first conversation in the dining room, how I was so lost and didn't even know it until you helped me see what really mattered." She smiled, her voice filled with emotion. "And I think about how much courage it took for you to defy everything you'd been taught and follow your heart. You've changed my life, Ethan. And you've changed mine," he said, kissing her forehead. "I can't imagine a life without you, Grace." They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around them. Above, the stars sparkled brightly, a reminder of the vast possibilities that had once seemed out of reach. The legacy of love. In the years that followed, Grace and Ethan continued to grow together. They became mentors to others, sharing their story to inspire people to chase their dreams and embrace their authentic selves. Their legacy wasn't just in the businesses they had built or the initiatives they had launched, it was in the lives they had touched, the relationships they had nurtured, and the love they had shared. One day, as they walked through the gardens hand in hand, Grace paused to admire the roses she had tended for years. Their beauty had only deepened over time, much like her bond with Ethan. "These roses remind me of us," she said, her voice soft. "They took time to grow, but they've become something strong and beautiful." Ethan smiled, pulling her closer. "Just like us." As they continued their walk, the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. It was a perfect metaphor for their journey, ever-changing, ever-growing, and endlessly filled with hope. And as they faced the future together, Grace and Ethan knew that their greatest achievement wasn't in the things they had built or the challenges they had overcome. It was in the love they had found and the life they had created, one that would inspire generations to come.